This is a workbench that's fairly typical of probably the 30s, 40s, 50s. I worked at something similar to this. The tools were very crude. We used a lot of hammer and chisel work because a drill set, drill index 6x64 through ½ inch was $250, and the same thing went for a ½ inch drive socket set. So we had a lot of crappy screwdrivers and a lot of hammer and chisel, and we had usually pretty crummy socket sets too, whatever was sort of left over. And every good shop had a spark plug cleaner, which roughened up the porcelain, and it was questionable even back then whether it saved the plug or not, but when they went out of the shop they'd work better, so we all had them and used them. Of course, weren't very politically correct. We all had pinups.
Oh, all the shops had those pictures there?
Every one that I ever went into, and everybody smoked.
So that explains everything.
Had a piston ashtray.
Oh, piston.
Piston ashtray. All right, now I'm going to go to the Alto outboards here. The Alto was Evinrude's second brand. This is a Evinrude light twin outboard, 3 horsepower, 1924 rudder twin. He was innovative in the use of aluminum. He was one of the first guys to do it. It had an Atwater Kent timer, and it had a what they called a 2-port at the time. It's a valved. It's a valved carburetor. It's a valve that acts like a reed. The only problem with them was they float when they get into high RPM, so they really weren't practical for high-speed use.
That's quite a rudder in the back there.
It's a battery-driven ignition, and it has a knob start, which is a little bit weird, but Alto used it for quite a while. They used it from about 1922, or actually even 1909, 1910, 1911, 1913. And then they came out, when Evinrude left the company, they came out with one that was basically a rope start.
That was one of the first motors that I ever acquired up by Augusta, in Pleasant Pond.
Well, that's Roscoe Bessie's motor. It doesn't actually belong to me.
Roscoe, right.
He was one of the guys that got us into the club.
Yeah, down in Union, right, Union, Maine.
Yep, he was a blueberry farmer.
Yes.
Yeah. This is a Super Alto Speedster right here, 1927.
Ooh.
They came out with a model to compete with all the rest of the racers in 27. It became a big thing to do. And this one produced 7 horsepower. All the other guys were up around 10 and 11 horsepower for the same, so it was kind of behind the 8 ball. But it runs well, starts well, but as far as speed goes, it left a lot to be desired. This right here is the high-speed Speedster. It had an air induction in the back. They came out with that in 1929. A little late to the diner, but it's very definitely competes with the Lockwood Chief. It puts out a lot of horsepower, runs very, very nicely. Again, it's battery ignition, Atwater Kent timer, and they do take a lot of different techniques to start them, but they do run well. They run very, very well.
So this was how much more horsepower than the other one?
This one puts out about a 10 to 11 horsepower, and that one puts out 7. And the only difference between the engines is basically that air induction.
Wow.
It's on the back side of the engine. Cayley came out with it first in 1928, and you had to do it manually. This one does it automatically. And this was a gift to Larry Carpenter.
Oh, from New Hampshire, right?
Yep, he gave it to me.
That's nice.
Actually in running condition. This one right here, this earlier one was bought from Peter Clark. This little Alto is from the 30s. It's a 0.9 horsepower. It's a 1937 engine. It also has a valved carburetor in it. It's a little valve that pops up when the engine piston goes up. It creates a vacuum, opens the valve, and when the valve opens, the gasoline's sitting right there, and it pops up and atomizes as it goes in with the air. That engine runs extremely well. I didn't expect it to. Once I changed the condenser, had the right condenser in it, has a kind of an odd size condenser, .1. It starts and runs very, very well. It was used for logging.
Logging?
Yeah, it was a gift from Paul Huber, who's an outboard mechanic in his 80s in Jefferson. Let's see what I can see.
It's kind of small for logging. Was it?
Originally used by Basil Acorn to pull logs across his pond to his mill ramp.
Wow.
He gave it to George Nash, a Maine game warden who was a bit of an inventor. He made floating swamp buggy and other stuff, and then he gave it to Paul Huber.
Lincoln logs.
This is a
Yeah, Lincoln logs. There you go.
right. This is a Minn Kota from the late 30s. As near as we can tell, it didn't have the serial number tag. It's missing, but from what I can see, there's very little information. It runs quite well. Has 3 speeds. It's somewhat noisy, but I suspect I've replaced one bearing. It probably needs to have both of them replaced. But it runs well and works well. Okay. Guess next, talk about this boat right here, which I purchased from Palmer Sargent. It's a 1913 Mullins. When I got it, it had the second engine in it. I had a customer from out in Martha's Vineyard that had the original engine, or one very much like it, and I purchased that from him. It took me 2 years to get it running. It was kind of rusty with salt water. The water cavities were all eaten out, but we were able to get it to work internally.
This boat came from Long Lake, Maine, down by Sebago?
Yes.
Yeah, Sebago, right.
It's the Songo lock connect the two.
That's right.
Right.
I found that in Uncle Henry's Swap and Sell, that one advertising, that advertising magazine. So that's where your boats are. Okay, keep shopping. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that's good. Anytime, Palmer. This is a battery-driven ignition. If you can see the dry cells underneath the seat, and it has a timer. It's not a set of points. It's just a carbon brush that hits a segment, turns on the buzz coil, which is underneath the seat as well, and then the buzz coil produces the spark. This was a deluxe model and has a transmission, forward, neutral, reverse. And it certainly comes from a time and era before OSHA, because everything is open and moving, and you have to watch yourself when you're running it. It has an engineer, sits back here. Typically, you have somebody up front steering the boat on the steering wheel. The engineer can do it also.
That looks like a real challenge. Beautiful. And you had some oak.
I had that made. No, those are spruce.
Was something made for this?
Yeah, that cap rail. I had the same thing was on there duplicated. They were kind of shattered.
Yeah, it looks original.
Yeah, it's the same wood that was on it originally. All right, over here we've got some Gale products and some OMC, all part of the same company. This is a Buccaneer. It's a little bit different than the stuff that Johnson's and Evinrude's made at the same time in the 50s. It's got a different engineer. It's got a very different design internally. It's very much like a Mercury as far as the power head goes. It does start and run very well, but it's not made for salt water. The shaft in it was mild steel, and it does corrode in seal cut. They made a number of them: Sea King, Montgomery Ward, CB, Goodyear, Brook, Lore, Spiegel. This one was a gift from Gene McKeever, who's a real estate agent. Insurance agent in Camden, Rockport. And then this Johnson right here, 3-horse Johnson, very popular engine. They made it from 1952. It was really the first unified engine that OMC came out with, made under one roof. The Evinrude and the Johnson were mechanically identical, but their covers were quite different. but everything else was the same under the hood. And this was one of the first one. This one came from Dan Weston. He's a member of the club who's no longer with us. And these are pretty much bulletproof. They had a little bit of problems with the floats. You know, if you left them, people generally never winterized them or did anything, and they'd run year after year after year. But after a while, they would get hit. The splines and the drive shaft, crankshaft splines should be greased every couple of years, and people never did that either. This right here is a TD20. It's a 5 horsepower. It's before they had the shift on it. Actually, it was just a neutral. And this engine was developed in the 30s. What's very unusual about this engine, it has 2 carburation systems on it. It has a crankshaft ported intake for low speed, and it has a piston ported intake for high speed. And it has 2 separate carburetors. One's mounted right on the crankcase, right over the crankshaft, which is hollow and feeds either side, and the other one is mounted right on top of the exhaust manifold for intake into the pistons for pretty much a direct charge. This here is a 5 horsepower, this one came from Bud Valley, this TD20, Bud Valley gave that to me. This 5.5 Johnson, pretty much the second in the series of unified engines. Again, Johnson Evinrude had exactly the same engines, except that the covers were different. Evinrude's covers split fore and aft, Johnson's split in the middle this way, and Evinrude split in the middle this way. And the Johnsons, you could take the cover off relatively easily without any trouble. With Evinrude, you had to unscrew the choke, and sometimes you had to take some other stuff off too, and they were quite a bit more difficult, but they were still exactly the same engine. This engine right here came from Drew Fales' uncle. Drew donated it to the museum. Let's see. This was a joint effort. I guess Finn Ergens and Clay Conover and Raynack, who was a wizard at doing investment casting. They all cooked these designs up and kind of passed one over Ralph Evinrude and Briggs. Briggs wanted full gear shift, but he wanted a built-in gas tank, and Evinrude wanted a separate gas tank, but no gear shift. They both felt. So what they did was they did put both on it and said the other approved it. So that was the end of that. They managed to fly it through. This is an Evinrude 10 in the later 50s, 57. Again, an excellent running engine. These really made OMC a lot of money, and they basically ran these models out for years. But they were at their best right about 1961 or 2 when they went to the single line gas hose and a fiberglass cover. They were about as simple and good as you could get. This was a gift from Ralph Blackington. He's comes from locally around here, but he lives in Massachusetts now. This is an 18. Again, that engine probably was one of the best ones they made in the higher horsepower category. It puts out a lot of horsepower, runs very, very well, and they run and run and run. These 3 engines here you have to even see today. Some people think they're only 10 years old, and they could be old as 40 years old. So these all had pressure tanks, twin hose pressure tanks. That was a drawback. You tilted the engine up with the gas tank hooked up and the gas cap not loose, then they pour gasoline right through the carburetor, so they were a little bit unsafe in that regard. These are some of the stuff from the 50s and 60s. This was an aquaplane. Drew Fales gave that to me. And these are Bruce Parker skis. This is what we learned how to ski on.
Wow.
You could tow behind a 10 horsepower with these set of these skis on and ski successfully.
Right.
And I think these were from Jerry Corson, who was a boat builder in Maine. They were kind of the sporty skis.
Cypress Garden skis.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Can't remember who gave those to me. Maybe you or Peter.
I think I did, yeah. That's why I mentioned it. That's
Okay.
right. There you go.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Is that from when you used to ski in Cypress Gardens?
Yes.
This is a Neptune. These were made by Muncie Gear Works. The employees asked if they could make them during the Depression after hours, and I guess the management allowed them to do that, so they produced outboards for, I don't know, through the 30s, up into the 50, 57, 58, and then they sold the company, and it went through a series of owners, and basically disappeared off the radar in the 80s. This is another one. This is probably the most popular one, the Mite. They made a ton of them. LL Bean made them, or sold them, excuse me, a gold version of that with a Tillotson pumper carburetor on them, and you still see those kicking around, but they run very well. They're well engineered, very simple, inexpensive to make. These here are some of the early Mercuries. They start basically down here. This is the Thor, which was an engine made by Cedarsburg Manufacturing. It had a very narrow power band, didn't operate very well. They don't run well. They don't start well. They weren't a great engine. Keycaver bought the plant after the guy went under, and he remade the engines and sold them to Montgomery Ward, the Sea King right here, and that runs extremely well. He put in a one-piece crank instead of 5 pieces and put a tickler on the carburetor, and by doing that, made the engine so it operated quite well and quite easily. This one runs very well. Palmer Sargent, he gave this to me.
One of the first motors I gave him.
Yeah.
That's right. Way back in 1937, was it?
Yeah, right.
You gave that to him in
It's
1937?
1939.
Oh, it seems like that. Anyway.
All right, so that's in one of these pictures here. This engine's probably in one of those famous pictures of Keycaver in the factory. And
A nurse had that. I used to go scuba diving with her.
right,
Yeah. Tina.
Tina. This right here is another Sea King. I was given this on my 50th birthday by the guys in the club. This is pretty much all a Mercury design, 1940. Had a dashpart carburetor again, though, like those Evinrudes. This one runs very well. And it had a cast aluminum tank. They had some had turn plate, which rusted through and disintegrated quite rapidly. But this is pre-war.
Lincoln, let's back up to this motor here. Wasn't this given to you at one of your birthdays?
Yeah, 50th birthday party.
Down in Wiscasset, Maine.
Yes, right. Yeah,
Yeah, that's right.
yeah,
Good old days.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
50, that was a couple years ago.
Yes, it was 18.
Right. Youngin.
Yeah, and this is a post-war 3 horsepower. These engines look very similar. They are not very much alike in a lot of ways. This engine right here had an oscillating pump. It had solid bearings, and it had a dashpot carburetor. This thing has a reed valve with a standard float carburetor. It has a standard water pump that has vanes on it, like the modern ones today, and the engine is all roller bearing.
And that came from whom?
I'm not sure if I had, maybe see if I can find it. Don't know where this one came from.
Okay.
What model is that?
It's a KD3 Comet.
So that was quite a step up then, as far as technology.
Well, horsepower-wise, yeah, because it was went from solid bearings to roller bearings, which gave it basically another 20% more horsepower.
Okay.
This right here is exactly the same engine as this one right here,
Wow.
except it's newer. They changed the whole scheme and color and everything of these things, and so this engine right here runs the same way this one. They made it from 47 to 48. I bought this from Art Stanley, who's a marine diesel mechanic in Owl's Head. It has a Bendix scintilla mag and it works quite well. These are some of the training school things they used in the 50s, 40s, late 40s, early 50s in training schools. This right here is a Mark 25, 1954. It's the first year they came out with the Mark 25, and this is an electric start version. Right here you could either get it with controls or start it on the side. It's kind of an odd starter motor system, but it does work.
It's a pretty looking motor, nice and sleek.
Yeah, they're not bad looking. It's still silver and mercury green. The next year they became colored. Like this engine right here is actually, this is a different color than this green right here, because this one this has a metallic color to it. It's one of about 5 or 6 colors that were available. And the leg is santan.
Electric start also for the...
Electric start, right?
Oh yeah, for 30 horsepower, yeah.
These engines worked fine. When they first came out with them, they had spiral bevel gears in the lower unit, which were terrible. They couldn't stand the horsepower. And this engine puts out quite a bit of horsepower. I was kind of disappointed in this engine for a lot of years, but I used it last summer, and the thing all of a sudden broke in on me and worked absolutely great. It took off, yeah.
Does this have the same block as the Mark 55 model?
No, it's the same. It's the same physical size block, but it has much smaller holes in it for the pistons.
Oh, okay.
And actually, the block for this weighs more than the one for the Mark 55.
Wow.
Yeah, if we had the two separate, this one weighs more.
Interesting.
Am I going pretty fast?
No, we're going good.
This right here is a tank Palmer Sargent gave me. It goes with this KE9. This was the first 4-cylinder engine that Mercury came out with. It was very innovative, put out a lot of horsepower, but within a year they'd figured out how to really get some horsepower out of it. And my suspicion is that a lot of the races were won by a guy who, for the factory, had them modified. They changed the porting in them, and the KG9 ended up being the ported version. This thing, compared to the KG9, is zip for horsepower. It just doesn't go very fast.
Now this tank, why is the tank so big in comparison to other tanks?
It was just the tank they had at the time. I don't know. I really don't. This thing has a AC fuel pump in it. It's not pressure fed like the later ones were. That's a pressure fed tank right there, like the Johnson Admiral's 2 hoses. This engine right here came from Ted Miller. I bought it
From Florida.
Yeah, it's got so very odd. These are actually Allen nuts on here. This thing has studs with Allen nuts. That's what these things are right here. You have to use an Allen wrench on it, but the stud, you can see the screw comes through it. Instead of being what we're used to, a hex nut, it's an Allen nut. This Mark 30. Oh yeah, this engine right here, to come back to this, came from Albie Cronenberg. He was a guy who had a big dealership on Lake Apatacon in New Jersey. And Albie raced the big boats, the big inboards and offshore racing. And I think it tired out his pocketbook from what I understand. This one right here came from Ted Miller from Florida. He was a repair guy down there. I don't think he was ever a dealer, but he was involved in he did a lot of racing for a lot of years in the 50s and 60s. He was involved in that. And this is a Mark 50 right here. It actually is pretty much the same block as the KG9. The KE9 was experimental. It's all sand cast. It was basically a handmade engine. This engine right here was mass produced, and the KG9, the Mark 40, they all share pretty much the same block. This engine came from Charlie Woodward. He lived down in Bristol, local guy, and he owned everything weird that Mercury ever made. He had a 60. inboard, outboard, a 60 Renault. And those engines, in salt water, they'd last about 2 days. They had copper head gaskets, and they'd corrode and literally disintegrate on the job. Charlie had a Merc 800 direct reversing, which I only saw 1 or 2 of in my life. So,
Now, was this a sand cast block
yeah,
also?
this is also a sand cast block, but very shortly thereafter they started investment casting it. But this was near the end of the sand cast. That was at the beginning of the sand cast.
For 1 year?
No. Yeah, they made this for 1 year,
Yeah.
54. But they had a Mark 55 that was sand cast for half of the production run.
Okay.
Your brother had one.
He did, okay.
Yeah, but it was salt water. It was a mess. But I saw that thing
Yeah.
complete, so I know it existed.
What's unique about this is this crown on the front there. That's
You think that's
from,
unique?
from a cosmetic point of view.
All right, okay, very good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That helps it run a little better, I think.
yeah. You think? Maybe.
Well, in your dreams, yeah. Sure. There we go. Get a good picture there.
While we're right here, I'll go on to the Evinrudes. We got a little stand for the Evinrudes. The first one right over here, this is a 1927 model Evinrude, but it's very, very similar to the original ones that Ole made. But what's kind of interesting about this engine is in 1913, Bess Evinrude got sick. And she was the brains behind the company. I don't think there's any question about that. But he came out with the engine in 1910. And by 1913, he had gotten an investor involved who owned half of the company. He was able to sell out his half of the company by 1913 and retire for 5 years and cruise around the Mississippi and the eastern half of the United States until 1920, and then start the company Elto, which made those things. So he did extremely well. But anyhow, in 1913, the guy who owned the company then, Chris Meyer, they came out with basically a pull start. It wasn't really a rope. They had some kind of a leather strap thing that fit in there. This thing, even though it's later, still had that. And the other thing this thing has got, Ole Evinrude did not believe in magneto ignition. And that's having the magnets under the flywheel and the coils and having it basically self-generating. He was a great believer in battery ignition like those over there with the knock wheel. And the funny part is when he left the company, that's the first thing they did is put a magneto in them. And I guess they ran quite well, and then they changed the magneto, and then later ones didn't work quite as well. This belonged to a guy who used this for pushing ice logs. He had an ice business in Connecticut, and they cut the pond ice up and used this to push the blocks of ice up to the conveyor belt right here.
Oh, Ernest Groth.
Yeah. This is a film of them actually using the outboard to do that.
Wow, that's history right there. That's great.
And this is actually his Springbrook ice service 75th anniversary.